Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
I think it's challenging. It's not impossible, but it's challenging to rescue a bad sales campaign with a good proposal.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most listened to B2B sales show. If you haven't already, make sure you click subscribe and let's meet today's guest.
I'm Bob Apollo. I'm the founder of Inflexion-Point Strategy Partners. We're a UK-based value selling experts.
On this episode with Bob, we're diving into the essentials of winning sales proposals. We go super granular, super step-by-step on this. There's a ton of value in this episode. If you regularly find yourselves getting RFPs thrown at you or putting together proposals for potential customers, this is the episode for you. It's going to make you more money. And with that said, let's jump right in. In this episode, we're diving into the essentials of winning sales proposals, and let's tee it up with a bang here, Bob, and we'll give some real value to the audience from the very beginning of this episode. If we've got a winning proposal on one side or one hand, and we've got a terrible losing proposal on the other, what would be the one biggest difference between the two of them?
That the winning proposal talks directly to what's really important to the customer. And, is structured around the customer's opportunities, their challenges, their issues. The losing proposal, all too often, is a showcase for, the vendor's products or solutions. I see that distinction all the time. If you fail to truly understand what the customer's trying to achieve, and that, by and large, is probably not buying your product. It's achieving some business goal. If you fail to focus on that, your chances of being successful, it's not really about the proposal either, because the proposal is a culmination of an effective dialogue with all of the key stakeholders in the customer. A proposal isn't an isolated event. It's, if you like, the pinnacle of a successful exploration and influencing of the customer.
So with that said then, Bob, what does that physically look like on, I want to touch on whether we email this over, whether it's software that we send over to track, whether it's been opened, all this kind of stuff in a second. But what does a successful proposal, a winning proposal look like on paper then? Because it seems like you're discussing there that we should even just jot down all the previous conversations that we've had, and that makes up the proposal, as opposed to what I've done in the past and what I typically see, which is almost a list of specifications of our product.
No, I think you certainly need, if the customer has got a specification, if they've issued an RFP, I think you're really obliged to understand the intent of their RFP and not try to game the system or be opaque or incompletely answer what they're looking for. But that's really not enough. No, and I'm not suggesting that the proposal should be a stitching together of all of the detailed conversations. I think the detail is generally important in a proposal, but the fundamental element of the proposal is what you might call the executive summary. And that executive summary is a distillation, of the essential points of the dialogue you've had with all of the key stakeholders in the customer. And in fact, you don't want that to be so overly detailed that it might look so thick that it would stop some of the important decision makers reading it. Being succinct, being focused, being short is actually very important in the executive summary, because that's the one thing that you have a pretty good chance that all of the stakeholders will pay attention to. You can't guarantee that all of the stakeholders will necessarily read all of the detailed aspects of your proposal, but you can hope and you can target your executive summary as being, the thing that, if nothing else is read in detail, is is looked at by all of the stakeholders, who may include and this would not be uncommon, would it? People who you have not engaged with, you've not had conversations with. You may not even have identified some of these stakeholders. So the executive summary is a really essential element of getting your message and your thinking across in the right sort of way.
So we'll see if we can distill down the executive summary in a second, perhaps as a structure to building one up. But before that, maybe a better question than the one I just asked you, Bob, would be how much of the sale is won before we even get to the proposal? And is the goal of, and if the answer is a lot, is the goal of a proposal just to tie things together nicely and to go for the buyer to go, okay, this makes sense, rather than for it to be a last minute ditch attempt to win some trust and win the business?
It should be in a perfect world, and we'll go on to explore the imperfection of a lot of sales situations, the culmination of a series of conversations, of agreements, and so on. I think if you're running a good sales campaign, then the content of your proposal should not come as a surprise. I think it's challenging. It's not impossible, but it's challenging to rescue a bad sales campaign with a good proposal. And it's a bit like what often follows from the sales proposal, and that's the negotiation. So again, it's really hard to use closing tricks or techniques to compensate for not having done a very effective job earlier on in the process. These things, the idea of teaching salespeople how to close, my experience and my view is you're much better investing in teaching salespeople how to open and lay the foundation of their sales campaign, and not thinking that techniques or tricks can, get the thing over the goal line. A Hail Mary pass. It's not impossible, but it's a pretty awful business model. Now, I'll make another observation, though, and it is that in certain cases, the first time you become aware of an opportunity might be at a very late stage in the customer's decision-making process as a consequence of them issuing either a tender document or a request for proposal. And I think if that does come as a big surprise to you, you need to be extremely thorough and careful in assessing whether it is in your interest to respond to that RFP. As you'll know, some markets are more regulated than others. But if you haven't influenced the content of that RFP, either directly or indirectly, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to win unless the customer is using some sort of least cost criteria, and you turn out to be the lowest cost credible option. But for somebody who evangelizes value selling, attempting to win by being the lowest cost option isn't a strategy that I strongly promote. You have to recognize that certain markets behave in a more regulated way than others. Yeah.
Well, I know selling medical devices in the beautiful UK, or the very cold, wet, snowy UK at the moment, to the NHS. It's super regulated, and we would typically, there's only really 2 or 3 players in the industry in endoscopy in the world, but specifically here in the UK as well. And we would always find that whether we knew about the tender or not, we knew who was going to win it because of a series of specifications within the tender about our camera systems capability versus the competitors' camera systems capability.
You'd hope to see your language in there, your specs in it.
There was one very specific specification on the hertz of the monitor, the refresh rate of the monitor. It made no difference to the procedure whatsoever. It made no difference. You can barely even tell with your eyes. But we had one refresh rate, they had another refresh rate. And so you could tell, well, clearly they've been in the account, they've done all the work, they've got this kind of wrapped up before we've even stepped forward of here. But I want to just ask you on one thing, because you took the word out of my mouth, or the sentence out of my mouth, with this, Bob. Is it cut and dry that we should, if someone has clearly got the specifications going in their favor, clearly someone else has got relationships within the account, is it cut and dry that we should just not bother with them? It's not a good use of our time to respond to that RFP, or is it worth a Hail Mary chance at diving in there and having an incredible executive summary? And is there any hope of winning a large B2B deal based on the back of just that alone?
It's not impossible, but it's most definitely a long shot. And therefore, I think you need to take other factors into consideration. So one of those factors might be, despite the fact we might not have a great deal of hope about winning this opportunity, is this organization strategically important to us in the long term? And is it our judgment that investing in the process, whether or not it necessarily results in a win now, exposes us to that organization in a way that is beneficial to our long-term prospects? But I tell you, it's awfully easy for salespeople to put that sort of justification in place.
Yep.
And it's my experience that you always have to be extremely thoughtful and considered in using that as a justification. So that would be, you'd step back and think about the whole strategic dimensions of the account and maybe your past history. I'd also take into account things like, even if the organization is being rigid about what they expect in the RFP response, I might be more inclined to reply if I knew that I was going to be given an opportunity to present my proposal rather than just submit it. Because if we're put into an environment where we have that chance to present it, then a bit more of the agenda's in our control. And one tactic which I've seen used actually to very good effect by clients who work in the more regulated industries like healthcare is knowing that they're going to be given an opportunity to present their proposal, to only invest a relatively modest amount of their time in actually presenting the proposal during that session. Because they've already issued it, you can refer in overview to the key elements of the proposal. But they actually use the tactic of saying, and we want to invest some of the time with you to draw upon our experience of other similar environments and to talk to you about things we had hoped to see in the RFP, but which you hadn't asked for. And even if we fail to win this bid, we at least will have had the opportunity to share what we hope you'll find to be very valuable experience in your future considerations. And that, actually, sometimes it worked immediately on that project, but that very often stimulated an improvement in a long-term relationship, the opportunity to really get into dialogue and build on some of the insights that you were able to share during your presentation window.
I know I've never gone into a tender process on the back foot and won the tender through an amazing demonstration, especially with the camera systems I used to sell. Demonstrations would pretty much always go okay, because clearly if they didn't go okay, you wouldn't be able to sell that product into a hospital operating room if there was any doubt that it would fail or anything like that. So the demo was kind of a mute point, an opportunity to build relationships, perhaps. But I have kiboshed other people's deals on the back of going in just from a demonstration or things like this. And I don't think I'm explaining that very well. What I mean is, if I'm on the back foot, I haven't won a deal outright by doing a better presentation. Clearly, the odds are stacked against you. But I have put enough doubt in people's minds through not being weird or manipulative about it or trying to stick it to the other salespeople involved with the process, but by being cliche, I know, but consultative and because I'd worked for both of the main players within the industry, I knew both sides of the products very well. I could very confidently talk about our products, their products, and recommend when it's appropriate for them, recommend when it was more appropriate for us. and got deals just stopped. So got to the point of a hospital trust needing to do more due diligence, which then buys
Right.
us time, and that's probably a win in that scenario,
So,
right?
so what you're doing is helping the customer to move backwards in their decision-making process to a point where they reconsider some of their priorities. And that can be an extremely effective tactic. And it can be done, as I think you've acknowledged, without any knocking of the competition, because it's not really necessarily directly about product spec and product spec. It might be about, you use the word consultative selling, posing a what if, how would you deal with this situation? What would happen if that situation were to prevail? You just cause them to rethink some of the assumptions they might have made. And you're more of an expert than they are very often, because they know their, in the medical world, they know their hospital, their unit, etc. But you and your fellow salespeople and the others who represent your organization have the benefit of accumulated knowledge and seeing things across multiple similar scenarios in a way it would be nigh on impossible for anybody who worked in one role in one organization to have been exposed to. And I think that's one of the foundation stones of effective consultative selling, and that organizations who do a good job of pooling that knowledge and that experience in a way that their salespeople can pose what if questions, they can tell stories, they can share insights. And what you're doing is sort of presenting your company's collective learning to
What does
your
that what
prospects.
does that look like, Bob? And we'll tie it back to RFPs and proposals in a
Sure.
second. But I think this is a really interesting fact, and I've seen a couple of startups develop over the past kind of months and years to leverage some of this. But what does it look like to practically, I think you used the word, pool together these stories, these anecdotes, these data points? What does that look like for an individual salesperson? What should they be jotting down in a notepad somewhere, perhaps, and keeping track of, that they can then use in these scenarios to either put doubt in someone's mind or to use it as a point to confirm the verbal things that they're discussing within a
Well,
presentation?
there's an emerging family of platforms. You'll be familiar with many of them. I'm sure the customers are. I'm not here to promote one or another, that serve to organize sales content in a contextual way. Faced with this issue in this environment, here are some stories you can tell, here are some insights you can share. So actually, this is a really good example of practicing collective learning in sales forces. And what I do quite often is to facilitate that sort of experience sharing amongst the salespeople. I'll give you an example. What are the frequently asked, tough to answer questions that typically come up? And almost certainly your top performing salespeople will be agile enough to work out what the answers are. It's a terrible waste to have that that learning restricted only to the individuals who've gone down that experience path. So frequently asked, tough to answer questions and responses. That's one element that can and should populate your sales content. Next one, I often facilitate customer storytelling sessions. And there is a formula. Actually, it's drawn from the same formula that makes for a successful movie or a successful play, of what's the story arc that you can share with a customer about the experiences of other similar people in similar organizations. And this is so much more powerful than pitching or telling a customer something, because what you're doing, you're selling, no doubt about it, but you're doing it in an indirect and constructive way, by saying, well, when we work with this or that organization, they found themselves frustrated by this or that issue. I think that the risk with a lot of case studies is they almost imply a miracle cure. Customer has problem, we delivered solution, here's the outcome. But anybody who's been involved in a business or a hospital knows that solving complicated problems is more difficult than that. There will be frustrations, obstacles on the way. The customer might, or the hospital might try and fail to resolve a problem with one initiative. They tend not to be very comfortable in seeing that published in formalized case studies, but it is much more possible and just as professional and constructive to be able to tell a short story, a short, pithy story that has some of those elements of a good story, an objective, an obstacle, an attempt to resolve, the moment of resolution, and then the outcome. Yeah, not pretending that, these are miracle cures. Just buy our product and you'll fix it. Because anybody who works in the real world will know that solving difficult problems is sometimes a complicated exercise.
The reason I asked that then, Bob, and that was fantastic. That was an amazing overview. And I've actually done quite a few podcasts with amazing storytellers recently, just to drill that into the audience, because I feel like this is a real differentiator for someone who comes in with a load of paperwork and bores people to death with case studies versus someone who's quote unquote charismatic, who can come in and tell stories and really grab people's attention, especially if that procurement officer is sitting through 5 presentations back to back on the kind of back of these RFPs. That's how you're going to be remembered. Excuse me. But it came to the front of my mind as I remember sitting in selling to the NHS. There was a chief of medicine equivalent. That's what they call in the US, but in the UK it's slightly different term. But a surgeon. There was a surgeon who'd be using the equipment, a urologist. There was a procurement officer and a theatre manager. And it was going, for want of a better phrase, it was going completely to shit. It was the worst meeting possible. I was brought on the back foot. I wasn't prepared for it. All these things going on. And I said one line, which again kiboshed the whole thing, and they ended up coming with us in the end. And just randomly, coincidentally, I'd been working down in London at a training event for the company, and I was working with some of the top surgeons in Europe, and they were all using obviously the company's equipment. It was trying to just indoctrinate them and instill into them, you buy our equipment, we'll send you on incredible training. Buy the equipment, come on incredible training. And I just mentioned one of the surgeons that was down there had struggled with 1, 2, 3 things with a competitor's product. It was a differentiator between us and them. It was the same end result, but a different way of it's basically how to print photos and the IT management of it, which is obviously all highly regulated with patient information and all this kind of stuff. It was slightly less laborious for us. This surgeon jumped out of his chair, this urologist, and said, I know that guy, I highly respect him. And he was all over it, and he wanted to work with us, and he was the advocate in the account from that point on. And it was probably 12 months it took to do the deal in the end. But we won on the back of that, just through there was no skill involved. It was just the fact that I'd been there a week before. It wasn't pre-planned. But I just mentioned this, and it had an incredible impact in that moment.
Yeah, people respect certain experts in their profession. They respect certain organizations who are seen to be early adopters, pioneers, organizations and people who get it, who they can relate to. And the great thing about storytelling is it helps the potential customer relate to somebody in a similar position, in a similar role, going through the same experiences. It's very important. You alluded to something else which I think is important. It's one of my golden rules. And again, I don't see it implemented as often as I'd like to. And there's a natural inclination amongst salespeople, particularly if the product has any technological basis, as I'm sure medical equipment and a lot of other, solutions have. And that's to focus almost exclusively down on we have a better solution track. We've got this spec, we've got that spec, etc. And the problem is buyers have come to expect that from salespeople to the point that they devalue claims of being better, or they're inherently not very memorable. But what's much more memorable is the other word you use, which is different. So it's always helpful, in my experience, to establish how and why you are different, why you've made a different choice in terms of your approach to solving this, and then evolve from that different platform to then prove how that choice, how that differentiation drives a better outcome for the potential customer. Different before better.
I've never considered that, but that's really interesting, because when you come across as we're the biggest, we're the best, we do this, well, it's almost how to describe it? It's almost from a point of fear that someone would say that. It's almost a point of I've got to push out my chest and put my arms out and look bigger than what I actually am, because I'm nervous about whatever's going on behind the scenes. Whereas if you just say, well, we're different here, we're different this, it's non-combative, it allows people to compare, and you can still kind of twist and turn it to where you need it to be. But I love that. I've never had anyone say that before on the show.
So one of the things I coach the sales teams I work with is certainly this different before better, but also initiate the conversation. So there's this tendency amongst people who've read books like The Challenger Sale to think that I've got to provoke the customer. I've got to insist that they've got a latent problem or they're missing an opportunity. And the problem is, if that's done naively, it really gets the customers back up. And actually is a much more effective approach, which is to base the initial part of your conversation around the unarguable trends that are happening in their world. That might be technology trends, it might be manpower trends, it might be litigation trends. But what you're looking for is an anchor, a platform of change that is unarguable. The only question might be how soon they, as an organization or personally, are going to be impacted by the change. But it would be very difficult to argue that broad change is not going to affect them. And you can then pivot from that to explore the potential consequences of that trend, of that unarguable trend, for them as individuals and for their organization. And you can pose the sort of, so what if? And what are your plans for dealing with this? And how have you tried to deal with it? But the combination of trends as a foundation and differentiation before better generates measurably better conversations. And by the way, no surprise, if you then reflect that conversation in the executive summary of your proposal, it is inevitably a much more powerful and persuasive document.
What a pro, bringing us back on track here. I was going to do it myself, but I didn't even need to. Amazing. Well, with that, Bob, there's two things I want to wrap up on here. One is we've touched on it, and clearly this is a huge part of it that you just nailed there. What's the structure of a executive proposal, knowing that that's going to have the biggest bang for buck out of the whole document? Is there a ideal structure for it?
I think there's a general structure which might need to be adapted to particular circumstances. And by the way, I think if you carry this in the back of your mind from the start of the sale, you know the things you want to be exploring and agreeing with the customer that will then be reflected in the executive summary. So it's almost a working backwards thing. So here's what I find missing in a lot of, even when the executive summary exists, the salesperson assumes the customer is going to buy something. And so, it starts around, and the reason you need to buy our solution is X. But the truth of the matter is, customers' choices include, don't do anything for the moment. Stick with the status quo. So actually, I think the first thing that any executive summary needs to do is to sell the need for change. never mind change to our solution. It is to sell the need for change, to highlight the cost and consequences of sticking with the status quo, using things that have been discussed and agreed with the customer. I think then, having laid that foundation, the exec summary then needs to pivot to say, and our approach to solving this problem, the differentiated mindset, is based on the following principles. You keep it very succinct, but you're going through this different before better. Yeah, I think so. It's common for people to say a proposal should include a return on investment, and I agree with that. It's less common for people to recognize that a proposal needs to reflect the cost of inaction, the cost and consequences of just staying as you are, because that's a very common outcome. Most buying journeys end up stumbling or failing, unless there's unarguable case for urgent action. At minimum, they might say, yes, we need to do this, but we need to delay it because it's not a high priority as something else. I think one of the things you need to recognize in an executive proposal is your competition isn't just your obvious competitors. Your competition is all of the other ways that the hospital or the customer organization could spend their resources and their energy. They will always have more projects, more purchases than they could possibly afford or manage at any one time. So you've got to recognize that your competition isn't just the other medical device manufacturers who's in your space. It might be investing in extending the hospital car park, to take a particularly lateral view, right?
Well, a lot of the time it was hiring another surgeon or more nursing staff, because they're massively understaffed here in the UK.
Absolutely, right? And it's very naive, I think, to believe that the customer's inevitably going to buy something, and it's just a shootout between you and the other solutions to this problem. I think it's extremely helpful to articulate the need to solve the problem in the first place, and not make an assumption that they're just going to do that. I think, hire a surgeon versus invest in equipment, that must be a trade-off that the financial committees in hospitals are discussing all the time. You can't ignore it or escape it. I think the next thing, having established your differentiation, is certainly then to do what many proposal experts recommend, which is to have some sort of, return on investments and payback projection. But again, I'd encourage people not to make the mistake of just leaving that as generic for the organization. Because if you've done a decent job with the stakeholders, you ought to be able to briefly and succinctly summarize what this means for the medical staff is X. What this means for the IT staff is Y. What this means for the financial department is another factor. So there's a sort of so what's in it for my organization? What's in it for my function or my department? And what's in it for me? I mean, I'm not suggesting you do it in that naive and crude way, but the exec summary should articulate why each of the respective stakeholders or functional departments would see value in going ahead with the proposal. Yeah.
Makes total sense. I love it. It's very structured there. I'll put this in the show notes. I'll break it down for the audience as well. So anyone who is kind of running on a treadmill trying to scribble things down on the back of their hand can just go in the show notes to this episode. Over it, we'll do salesman.org/Bob the Proposal Master. That's be the show notes for this episode. One final thing. Well, two things. One very quick question, and then one probably a slightly longer one, which could be a whole show on its own, but we'll go for it quickly. The quick question: when we send a proposal Should we be attaching a PDF to an email? Should we be doing exactly what they tell us we should do? Or should we be trying to, as forcefully, politely as we can, send a proposal through one of the many proposal softwares out there which track when it's opened and how often it's clicked and when it's shared? Kind of a quick one liner to that, Bob. What's the best way to send a proposal once it's been requested?
Well, yeah, if you want my overall view, do what you have negotiated and agreed with the customer rather than slipping a sleight of hand in. And if you see value in having that sort of tracking approach, at least agree it with the customer that they would see value in. You've got to think about it from their perspective and not about yours. So, whatever mechanism you choose, if you're trying to promote one over another, you've got to try and project it as being of some benefit to the customer.
And then final one on this before we get on to the final question to ask everyone that comes on the show. And perhaps you can just, if possible, list a couple of these out, and maybe we can go through these on another time, another episode. But you talked about the criteria for winning a RFP, for winning a proposal at the top of the show. Clearly, strong ROI is the obvious one, but what are some of perhaps the other criterias or unobvious criterias which can win a deal, especially when you're dealing with a procurement officer versus someone who's actually using the product?
Yeah, I mean, I think too many people think of procurement as, your combat. You're in combat against them, and I think you've got to understand things from their perspective. And they're trying to do a good job for their company. They might come across to you as a salesman as being obstructive and counterproductive, but they're only doing their job. But before deciding to respond to an RFP, I'd certainly want to be thinking about the sort of things that you've raised. Did we participate in the shaping of the RFP? Is there language or specification in the RFP that reflects either our capabilities or strongly reflects competitors? Do we understand the organization's approach to contracts and tendering? Are they working on you've always got a minimum of 3 bids in, or at least, in order to have a legitimate procurement process?
And Bob, sorry to drop there, but is that, I know hopefully the answer is yes, but is that an appropriate question to ask someone when you get a RFP thrown in your face, or when you get called up and someone inquires about this kind of stuff? Maybe you're on the back foot with some of it. Should we be asking these questions of how is this judged? How many people are involved? Are we going to get someone's backs up by asking these questions, or are they expecting us to ask them?
Well, I think if people's backs are got up by asking those questions in a constructive and professional way, then your chances of influencing their thinking are pretty remote.
Sure.
Anyway, I think it's professional.
Yep.
Right. And by the way, procurement teams, you'd hope, should pride themselves on being professionals. I think now they may not choose to answer you, but I think it's entirely legitimate and professional to ask the question in an appropriate way. I mean, not do it in a way that implies conditionality. We're only going to go ahead if you reveal all of this. But I think it is, we're all professionals. I think this is one element of behaving like, but salespeople behaving like professionals is, I think, completely legitimate to ask those sort of questions of the exercise. I mean, after all, this is not a trivial investment for your organization, right?
Yep.
And I think there's a mutual quid pro quo professionalism. I think one other question I'd certainly want to ask, if it wasn't offered, is if we respond to the RFP, will we be given the opportunity to present our proposal rather than just deliver it? But I think that tells you a lot about the sort of process that they're going to go through.
Amazing. Well, because the reason I asked that is because I've got a very vivid image of my sales manager looking at me like I'm a complete idiot when he asked me what the criteria are for the proposal that I just spent, as you kind of alluded there, hours and hours and hours working on over a weekend. And when I turned around to him and said, I don't really know, he looked at me like I was an idiot. And it was because I didn't know that I could ask for it. I thought it was some top secret thing that they're working on behind the scenes and it was all weighted in different places. And it makes you look like an amateur, perhaps, if you don't ask these questions.
I mean, for example, asking and expecting them to reveal their weighting rules. Now, sometimes the RFPs do that, but, quite often customers prefer to keep a little bit of mystery behind how they're going to weight things. I think it varies from industry to industry. So they're not guaranteed to always give you the answer, but I think it is always legitimate to ask the question in the appropriate way.
Perfect. Well, with that, Bob, I've got one final question for you, mate, and that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
At every point in your development, find a mentor that you can learn from. And I did that on quite a few occasions. But, I think there are always opportunities to learn. And as a corollary of that, make your career choices based on your belief that you'll be able to learn something valuable from both the organization and the people you're going to be working for.
Amazing stuff. Well, Bob, as the master of value selling, I want you to tell us a little bit more about where we can find out more about you and all the value selling and all the training that you do. And it shows your website with us as well. So
my website is at www.inflexion-point.com. So that's inflexion, inflexion-point.com. And there's a bunch of resources available on the blog. All you need to do is add /blog to that URL. I'd welcome visitors to the site, and I hope you'll perhaps find the information useful. There's a bunch of stuff that you can read and download, and I always welcome feedback about how my audience has been able to apply those principles. All right.
Good stuff. Well, I'll link to that in the show notes to this episode over at salesman.red. And with that, Bob, I want to thank you for your time, the insights on this. I think this is a really valuable episode for the show, really practical. I appreciate that, mate. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
I've been very happy to spend this hour or so with you. Thank you for the invite.